Let's bring ourselves to the present moment with a couple of breaths. Today, we're going to look at self-compassion. We will start by defining what it is, what it isn't, and look at the three aspects of self-compassion. Next, we'll look at our blocks to self-compassion, some tips for feeling safe, and explore a self-compassion practice. Quite a bit of the content of this Dharma talk comes from Kristin Neff's book, Self-Compassion. So let's begin by defining compassion. Compassion means to suffer with. When love meets pain and stays loving, it turns into compassion. Self-compassion is being a good friend to yourself. Unlike self-care, self-compassion can help you in the moment. Self-care, like taking a bath, going for a walk in nature, or getting a massage, helps you off the job, but you need time and/or money for self-care. In addition to self-care, self-compassion includes emotionally caring for ourselves. You might look at self-compassion as an inner support system which provides you with resilience. We treat ourselves with the same kindness, caring, and compassion we would show to a good friend. If we treat our friends like we treat ourselves, we wouldn't have any friends at all. Self-compassion does not try to capture and define the worth or essence of who we are as self-esteem does. Self-compassion is not a thought or a label, a judgment or an evaluation. It is caring about ourselves, fragile and imperfect as we are. As my sisters would say, it's accepting that we're not golden but tarnished bronze. With self-compassion, we stop trying to label ourselves as good or bad and simply accept ourselves with an open heart. Unlike the practice of positive affirmation, you don't have to fool yourself to make it work. Self-criticism asks if you're good enough. Self-compassion asks, what's good for you? Self-compassion involves wanting health and well-being. It differs from self-indulgence, which encourages short-term pleasure at the expense of long-term harm. Think eating a carton of Ben & Jerry's. Self-compassion has been shown to lead to proactive behavior to better one's situation. When we soothe our agitated minds with self-compassion, we're better able to notice what's right as well as what's wrong, so we can orient ourselves toward that which truly gives us joy. Research shows self-compassion is strongly linked to well-being. It brings about a reduction in anxiety, depression, stress, perfectionism, shame, body dissatisfaction, and disordered eating. Self-compassion is linked to more life satisfaction, more happiness, and more optimism. Thus, it's a powerful way to achieve emotional well-being and contentment in our lives. By giving ourselves unconditional kindness and comfort while embracing our difficulties, we avoid destructive patterns of fear, negativity, and isolation. The three aspects of self-compassion are mindfulness, self-kindness, and a sense of common humanity. Let's look at each of these. Mindfulness is the idea that we need to see things as they are, no more, no less, so we can respond to our situation in the most compassionate and therefore most effective manner. To give ourselves compassion, we need to see that we are suffering. We often fail to recognize feelings of guilt, unworthiness, sadness, loneliness, and so on as moments of suffering. One of my concerns about becoming a mindfulness meditation teacher was that I have not really suffered, or so I thought. Even when I got divorced, I didn't recognize the suffering. I was too busy fixing so I could minimize the impact on my kids. Only a master of brush it under the carpet would not recognize the suffering in a divorce, no matter how amiable. With mindfulness, I am seeing lots of suffering under that carpet. When we are cold and callous with ourselves, it's easier to deny our suffering. When we offer ourselves the same quality of unconditional kindness that we would offer to a friend, we can stop denying our suffering. When you look in the mirror and decide you're too short or that your nose is too big, do you immediately tell yourself that these feelings of inadequacy are painful and deserving of kind, caring response? When your boss calls you into his office and tells you that your job performance is below par, is your first instinct to comfort yourself for going through such a difficult experience? Christian Neff says probably not. Our minds tend to focus on the failure itself rather than the pain caused by the failure. This is a crucial difference. When we see something about ourselves that we don't like, our attention tends to become completely absorbed by our perceived flaws, so we don't have the perspective needed to recognize the suffering, let alone respond to it with compassion. Most people, even if they don't blame themselves for their suffering, tend to immediately go into problem-solving mode, like I did with my divorce. While problem-solving is necessary, we need to recognize that the suffering takes a lot out of us emotionally. We need to stop for a breath or two, acknowledge that we're suffering, and provide ourselves with a kind, caring response. If we don't, we risk getting exhausted and overwhelmed because we're spending all our energy trying to fix problems without refreshing ourselves. Like a clear, still pool without ripples, mindfulness perfectly mirrors what's occurring without distortion. Rather than becoming lost in our own personal soap opera, mindfulness allows us to view our situation with greater perspective and helps to ensure that we don't suffer unnecessarily. When we notice our pain without exaggerating it, this is a moment of mindfulness. When you focus on the fact that you're having certain thoughts and feelings, you're no longer lost in their storyline. You can wake up and look around and take a best friend's perspective on your experience. This friend would soothe and comfort you with compassionate understanding. One of the enemies of mindfulness is the process of over-identification, becoming so carried away by our personal drama that we can't clearly see what is occurring in the present moment. Mindfulness practitioners feel like self-compassion is messing with things because mindfulness is about opening to what is. Self-compassion is caring for yourself, soothing yourself, comforting yourself, being there for yourself. If you try to use self-compassion to make the pain go away, that's a slippery form of resistance, and it won't work. Remember, mindfulness is aimed at the experience, and compassion is aimed at the experiencer. Self-kindness, the second aspect, begins with stopping the constant self-judgment and negative stories on our top 10 list. It requires us to understand our shortcomings and failures instead of harshly condemning ourselves. But self-kindness involves more than merely stopping our inner critic. It includes actively comforting ourselves, just as we would to a dear friend. We recognize that everyone has times they blow it, and we treat ourselves kindly. Christian Neff says, when we consistently give ourselves nurturance and understanding, we also come to feel worthy of care and acceptance. When we give ourselves empathy and support, we learn to trust that help is always at hand. When we wrap ourselves in the warm embrace of self-kindness, we feel safe and secure. When faced with our human flaws, we can respond with kindness and care or with judgment and criticism. Although we can't always change the channel on our judgmental thoughts, we don't have to encourage or believe them. With self-kindness, we can stop seeing ourselves as a problem to be fixed and begin seeing ourselves as valuable human beings who are worthy of care. The third aspect is a sense of common humanity. Self-compassion honors the fact that all human beings are fallible. Wrong choices and feelings of regret are inevitable, no matter how high or mighty one is. Whereas self-pity says, poor me, self-compassion remembers that everyone makes mistakes and suffers. When we focus on our faults and identify them as our faults, our perspective tends to narrow. We become absorbed by feelings of insufficiency and insecurity. We think we are the only one who's being ignored, rejected, or made a fool of. Our fears and self-judgments are like blinders. They keep us from seeing the hands that are being held out to help us. We may be ashamed to admit our feelings, but hiding our true selves from others makes us feel even more alone. When we're suffering, if we can remind ourselves that many others are suffering, then that moment becomes a moment of togetherness rather than isolation. We see we are not alone, and our suffering is reduced. So why is it that we treat ourselves in a cold and callous way instead of a self-compassionate way? There are 5 main reasons why we don't practice self-compassion. Let's look at the reasons and dispel the myths. First, people confuse self-compassion, being a good friend to ourselves, with self-pity, woe is me. With self-pity, we ruminate on our suffering as if thinking about it for the 50th time will change things. With self-compassion, we understand we're part of humanity that suffers, so we can step outside ourselves and see clearly. Second, when we think of being self-compassionate as weak, but it takes courage to have self-compassion, as you need to be with your difficulties. Research shows that veterans with higher self-compassion were less likely to develop PTSD. Self-compassion was a more crucial factor than the amount of combat they saw. So self-compassion is a huge source of strength and resilience. Third, if I'm self-compassionate instead of self-critical, I will not have any motivation. I'll lose my drive and not achieve my goals. Studies have shown that students were more motivated to succeed with self-compassion than with self-esteem. Why is self-compassion a more effective motivator than self-criticism? Because its driving force is love, not fear. Love allows us to feel confident and secure, in part by pumping up our oxytocin, while fear makes us feel insecure and jittery, sending our amygdala into overdrive and flooding our system with cortisol. Not only does self-compassion provide a powerful motivation engine for change, it also provides the clarity needed to know what needs changing in the first place. Fourth, self-compassion will lead to self-indulgence. Remember, self-indulgence is short-term pleasure at the expense of long-term harm. Again, studies have shown that self-compassionate people exercise more, eat healthier, and go to the doctor more. These behaviors do not necessarily provide short-term pleasure, but they do provide long-term well-being. Fifth, we think being self-compassionate is selfish or narcissistic. 100 couples were measured on a self-compassion scale. Then their partner completed a survey on how they were treated. Self-compassionate people were described as much more caring, more capable of intimacy, kinder, less controlling, and got angry less often. Before you engage in self-compassion exercises, it'd be helpful for you to know about the concept called backdraft. If firefighters open the door of a burning house, the oxygen let in will cause an explosive surge to the fire. To ensure this does not happen, the firefighters poke little holes around the building to let a little air in at a time. When you begin to practice self-compassion, you may experience backdraft, especially if you have trauma in your past. The backdraft, or explosion of emotions, simply tells you you need to slow down. Remember that when it feels too much, stop and take care of yourself. Start with the easier emotions and do a little at a time until you build up your self-compassion muscle. Here's an example of one of the self-compassion exercises you can find on Kristen Neff's website, selfcompassion.org. You may want to take out a piece of paper to jot down your thoughts, or just simply contemplate on them. First, think about times when a close friend feels really bad about him or herself, or is really struggling in some way. How would you respond to your friend in this situation, especially when you're at your best? Please write down what you typically do, what you say, and note the tone in which you typically talk to your friends. You may want to pause at this moment to think through this contemplation. Now, think about the times when you feel bad about yourself or are struggling. How do you typically respond to yourself in these situations? Please write down what you typically do, what you say, and note the tone in which you talk to yourself. Again, you'll want to hit pause if you'll need more time to get your thoughts down. Did you notice a difference? If so, ask yourself why. What factors or fears come into play that lead you to treat yourself and others so differently? Please hit pause if you need more time. Please write down how you think things might change if you responded to yourself in the same way you typically respond to a close friend when you're suffering. Please hit pause for more time. By practicing self-compassion, Christian Neff says, when you make mistakes or fall short of your expectations, you can throw away that rawhide whip and instead throw a cozy blanket of compassion around your shoulders. To learn about more exercises in self-compassion, go to Kristen Neff's website, selfcompassion.org. Thank you.